Hi, this is Melora Hardin. You can learn more about me at my website, www.melora.com. And this is U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guile. Continuing with our theme from last week, today we focus on 3 more authors with exciting new books on architecture and design. DJ Waldie is the Bard of Lakewood, California, with a new book, Becoming Los Angeles. Past podcast guest, the prolific Dominic Bradbury, has a new atlas of modernist icons. Finally, returning podcast guest Pierluigi Serraino is back. Pierluigi shares in his new book, The Modern Garden, how often-underappreciated landscape design was the secret sauce for mid-century modernist houses. And now your host, with another underappreciated secret sauce. I'm waiting to find out about this. Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
And you know, Tom, that the secret sauce on Big Macs is just Thousand Island dressing.
Yeah, I know. So is that your secret sauce?
No, I got another one.
Good.
People ask how usmodernist.org has grown so large over the years. Here's one thing we do. Have you ever wondered how some people let days, weeks, or even months pass before responding to your voicemail or email? They leave genuine clients or prospects or donors or customers or patients or whatever you call them hanging in a state of perpetual uncertainty. We're not talking about responding to spam. This is about responding to anyone who writes you a personal message. More than a few days delay, or even worse, ghosting them entirely, signals a lack of urgency, professionalism, and just leaves people bewildered. For 30 years, I've made it a practice to respond to every call, every email within a day. And trust me, I'm as busy as you are. The secret sauce here is setting aside a daily time, like a doctor's appointment. In banking, it's called the sundown rule. Everyone responded to by sundown, and it's easier than you think. A quick, got it, will respond later note is better than radio silence. A simple, I don't know, but I'll let you know next week, is infinitely more reassuring than not hearing back at all. How do I know this? From being on the other side of that email. We all want to be responded to, and the rewards are immense. We complain about how opportunity doesn't knock, but it's on us to answer the door on time. Otherwise, opportunity has better things to do. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger. And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
DJ Waldie grew up in one of the first planned suburbs on the West Coast, Lakewood, California. That's where he graduated from St. John Bosco High School.
Go Braves!
And later from Cal State.
Go Golden Bears!
Spending most of his life in the house his parents purchased back in 1946, he has written 4 books, including Holy Land, a suburban memoir, California Romantica, co-written with actress Diane Keaton, and the newest, Becoming Los Angeles. Here's George's conversation with DJ Waldie.
DJ, I guess my first question as a mid-century modernist fan is, what is that house on the cover of your book?
It's a photograph from a few years ago, taken somewhere in the desert fringe of Los Angeles. It's actually part of the city of Los Angeles. It looks like Palm Springs, but it isn't. I think it's out there toward the deserty part of the San Fernando Valley, perhaps.
Where would that be? What city would be nearby that?
You know, I honestly don't know. The photograph was taken by a French photographer who does work in Southern California. And I guess it's where the valley meets the desert, where the high desert comes in, but still in the city of Los Angeles.
Well, Los Angeles is what, like several thousand square miles?
Well, the actual square miles of Los Angeles is about 500 square miles,
Okay.
400 and some square miles. The county, of course, is far larger. But when we talk about Los Angeles, you and I,
Yeah.
we don't mean just the corporate limits of the city of Los Angeles. We mean this very big thing that stretches from Ventura to the north and all the way down to, oh, I don't know, the border of San Diego County. So that's the big thing anyone could call LA. So my Los Angeles isn't defined by the corporate limits of the city of Los Angeles, it's defined by state of mind, really.
Now, you grew up in a place, and I think are still there, Lakewood, California, which most people I don't think have heard of before. What's special about Lakewood?
Oh, well, surprisingly, it's rather well known in urban planning circles. Lakewood was developed all at once in the early 1950s by three developers, Ben Weingart, Mark Taper, and Louis Boyer. They built 17,500 houses in the space of 33 months. It was the largest mass-produced
Wow.
tract house suburb of the West Coast, followed after Levittown on Long Island. And in 1954, it pioneered a radical new form of local government organization called the Lakewood Plan, which was based upon the city as an institution with a city council and the usual appurtenances of a city, buying all of its services, contracting for all of its services from the county of Los Angeles. So that when Lakewood began, it had 3 or 4 employees and a 5-member city council. And it was the model for almost a quarter of the cities in California and about 2/3 of the cities in LA County.
Hmm. And when I look at it on the map, I expected to see like a big square, but it looks sort of like a crescent wrench, I guess. There's a square thing in the middle called Lakewood Village that's not part of actual Lakewood, right?
Well, visualizing the evolution of the landscape in my part of the southeast corner of LA County is pretty hard because the development of the area was based upon breaking up the boundaries of the old rancho system, which began in the 19th century, but which accelerated in the middle of the 20th century. And those boundaries and borders were like a jigsaw puzzle. And so Lakewood is a jigsaw piece in a very large jigsaw puzzle. So parts of Lakewood were developed in the 1930s, and those areas became part of Long Beach. And the rest of Lakewood was developed in early 1950s, and that became the city of Lakewood.
And you were a city manager in Lakewood for a while.
Well, my career in the city of Lakewood was fairly straightforward. I began as an assistant to the public information officer of Lakewood and then became myself the public information officer. And I ended my 30-plus year career with the city as the deputy city manager. So I was, maybe I reached the level of my competence by that point.
Oh, the old Peter principle, yes.
That's exactly the case.
And in writing this book, one of the things that I really like about it is that you inject yourself into it.
Yes.
You tell some stories about your experience, which isn't always the case when people are describing a place.
Exactly. My first book, called Holy Land, was a memoir of growing up in Lakewood in the 1950s. And it mingled accounts of my own life, accounts of my parents' life, development, history of Lakewood, and all kinds of other things, including where the water comes from and what kind of earthquake risk Lakewood has. So in my writing, I've always tried to connect personality and place. I don't make much distinction between nonfiction historical account and what you might call personal history that's felt, history that feels like something. And that's what I've tried to do in all of my writing, is to create a sense of history that feels like something.
And what was the myth around Los Angeles that people connected to the earliest? Was it the open spaces? Was it Hollywood? Was it the climate? What were they pulled to the most?
Well, if you go back into the 19th century, into the 1870s and 1880s, the story of Los Angeles is all about climate. If you come into the 20th century and you start looking at the evolution of a metropolis, the city of the future, then it's the city of glamour and Hollywood and the city of vast and sudden changes in the way people lived their lives. And into the middle of the 20th century, which is, of course, our concern here today, the story of Los Angeles is freedom and access to a larger natural world and the integration of a particular kind of modern house with a particular modern way of living. Los Angeles became the nation's best advertised and most successful lifestyle product.
I guess until the time that Jack Webb came along with Dragnet and tried to scare everybody with all the crime from all these young hippies roaming around.
Well, that's the other side of the sunshine story, is the noir story. And of course, that's a big part of the Los Angeles experience as well, because all of this smiley, sunshiny, Gidget goes to Malibu, Los Angeles, you have the dark alleys and the burden of guilt that informs the noir tradition in Los Angeles.
I love those movies about LA that are in that film noir style. I can think specifically of LA Confidential was like that.
Exactly.
And it showed the glamour and some of the grime at the same time.
Yes, in fact, it was important for a certain segment of the Hollywood film establishment to understand Los Angeles as a place that's uniquely treacherous, that it has its sunny exterior, but at its heart, it was dark. And that was important for a certain segment of the creative community in Hollywood, a way for them to understand the conflicts they lived in as creative people in an industrialized Hollywood.
One of the things that I always puzzle about in thinking about cities is how they connect with their airports. And it seems like, similar to LaGuardia, Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, has struggled for decades to get any kind of public transport, like a subway or a train, to come onto the property. Are they ever going to do that?
Underway now, there's the last link, the last mile problem is being solved by a people mover system from the one end of the light rail that extends from Norwalk all the way to El Segundo. There will be soon, not today, a way of getting to the airport by public transit, but terribly, terribly late. We began developing a light rail system that marginally replicated the old Pacific Electric system back in the early 1990s. And the airport should have been one of the first places light rail went. Now it's almost one of the last places that light rail is reaching, and it'll reach it by a people mover system, not by the kind of light rail system that connects to Chicago's airport, for example.
Is people mover just one long flat escalator? Is that what that means?
No, I think it's a bit more Disneyland than that. It'll be pods on wheels. I don't even know exactly what it will look like. It sounds to me like something from Tomorrowland.
Okay. So maybe monorail-like almost?
Who knows?
Okay.
It's being built, though. I do know that.
Los Angeles has been the scene of a couple of different Olympics, and it's got one coming up. How do the Olympics factor into the growth of the city or the attraction of the city to the rest of the world?
Well, Los Angeles has always been selling itself to the nation as a lifestyle product, as I mentioned earlier. And in 1932 Olympics, that was very important. Depression was underway. Los Angeles, as the rest of the nation, was somewhat rocked. Having the Olympics created a wonderful marketing opportunity for tourists. And that was a significant feature of the 32 Olympics. The 84 Olympics probably should be best understood as the city's shining moment. That was really an epitome and an apex of what Los Angeles thought of itself. A welcoming city, open to the universe, open to the world, a world city with connections to the Pacific Rim, and a world-class city. That was very important to the political leadership of Los Angeles then. The 2028 Olympics, we'll have to see what the selling point is. The city of Los Angeles has gone through some very difficult times. Riot, violence, earthquake, fire, the disasters that we're supposed to be inheritors of in Los Angeles. We'll have to see what the image of the city is when 2028 rolls around.
And as you've watched the city that you grew up in grow and develop, how does modernist architecture fit into its story?
Well, it seems to me that because of a gentle climate and a welcoming community of knowledgeable people who wanted to live in a modern way, Los Angeles became a test bed for some really quite remarkable modernist architecture. I would argue that homes are the premier art form of Los Angeles, and mid-century modernist homes are an expression of that in its purest and most exuberant way. Homes in a particular historical style were characteristic of Los Angeles at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, culminating with the Spanish colonial revival style. But mid-century homes in the post and beam style that we all know so well, they really reflect a passionate desire to live in a modern way. And that was a characteristic of the city then, but that is perhaps not as well understood or perhaps not as well represented today. It's hard to know what it means to live in a modern way in Los Angeles, although the builders of those post and beam houses knew exactly what it meant to live in a modern way.
I remember growing up reading about the freeways that were being built. And of course, traffic seemed to be a problem almost right away. And it hasn't gotten any better in Los Angeles, except for that brief moment during the pandemic when no one was driving anywhere. You had those eerily empty roadways. So how does LA deal with its own growth, with the traffic and the cars? I was out there recently, and I just couldn't believe how much traffic there was.
Yes, I don't think we actually are dealing with it. The various band-aids that have been placed over the traffic situation in Los Angeles, none of them have solved, quote, unquote, the problem. There was a brief period when I was a teenager and in college when it was, in fact, possible to drive almost anywhere in the metropolitan area of Los Angeles County in 20 to 30 minutes. That was because there was less than half of us living here then than they live here now. There are no solutions to the traffic problem unless, to a certain extent, we are thrown upon the 15-minute city model, unless we find ways to create neighborhoods that don't require driving around. Some of those have evolved, but they're very small and they have very little impact on the overall traffic situation.
I've read over the last number of years how people get attracted to Los Angeles, then they get tired of Los Angeles and leave. And now there's some pockets of places, I think, in Los Angeles people are either coming back to or creating. What are the newest exciting places in Los Angeles now that are emerging?
Places that people want to live in Los Angeles have been the places that have been desirable going back to the beginning of the 20th century, practically. People want to live near the ocean. People want to have access to the amenities of a big city. People want to have the security of a home. But what defines a home is changing. So what is happening in Los Angeles is, one, extant lots, which may have a single family home on it from the 1920s or 1930s, are being redeveloped as small multi-unit developments, townhouses, if you will, on a former single family lot. And you have multi-story residential areas that are developing. 20 years ago, you had lots of housing that was returning to urban core, as the urban core of Los Angeles. That's dropped off a bit in recent years. The downtowns may not be as appealing as they once were. People are still moving to the fringes of Los Angeles, miles and miles and miles away from downtown, living in areas that were once thought to be just the province of coyotes and groundhogs, but now are single-family homes stretching into the desert.
And what about the people that are in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, particularly with new things like AI and so forth? Are they coming into the city more, or are they moving away, do you think?
The entertainment industry, though significant to Los Angeles, and it was never the most important industry, it was just the most glamorous industry, has undergone a radical shift over the last 15 years. And the number of productions in film and television that are produced in Los Angeles has dropped precipitously. There's a great deal of anxiety in the blue collar side of Los Angeles film industry, Hollywood film industry, about where productions are going. The position of Hollywood as the image maker for the planet, as the place where all glamour concentrates, is fading some.
Well, I know that Vancouver, for instance, has stolen a tremendous amount of business from Los Angeles in the film industry.
Canada is a big destination for a lot of film and television production. Vancouver, Toronto. But then there are states in the East Coast and in the South where government subsidies have made production attractive. And there are, of course, efforts on the part of the state of California here to counter those subsidy projects by offering subsidies, greater subsidies here in Southern California.
Right. I know Georgia is really big on that. You see so many productions now coming out of Georgia.
Precisely. There are issues relating to unionization there that have a bearing on the cost of production as well.
How are the changes in materials and sustainability affecting Los Angeles, DJ? I mean, are people paying more attention to how construction causes climate change and adapting those methods as far as you see in new buildings?
Yes, that is happening, partly driven by state and federal regulations, partly driven by the interests of developers. The pace of new construction in Southern California is, it goes up and down. It's sometimes a little hard to get a handle on what's happening immediately. The characteristic new thing in Southern California, in the areas that I'm best familiar with, are ADUs, accessory dwelling units, the addition of 1, 2, or 3 homes, dwelling units on a conventional single-family lot.
Yes.
This is happening in my town of Lakewood rather rapidly, and it's happening elsewhere with some equal rapidity.
Well, I always enjoy coming out to Los Angeles. We were just there doing one of our Moon Over Modernism tours at a Ray Cappy house and a John Lautner house. And I hope that we'll be able to meet sometime in person out there. Thank you so much for talking with me.
That would be great.
George was talking with LA expert DJ Waldie. Returning podcast guest Dominic Bradbury is a prolific writer and journalist with a focus on architecture. With over 30 books, he is the king of beautifully photographed architecture coffee table books, including the Atlas of Mid-Century Modern Houses, the Atlas of Interior Design, and his newest, the Atlas of Mid-Century Modern Masterpieces. He's been published all over, including the Financial Times, Wallpaper, House and Garden, and Gallery. Welcome back, Dominic.
Thank you very much. Great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
Dominic, we know you write architecture books, but I just learned recently that you've also written scripts for TV. What have you been involved in that?
Well, not for quite a while. That was when I was kind of starting out as a freelancer. I did some script work with London Weekend Television, which I don't think even exists now, but it was, they chose 6 of us to work on some drama scripts. We were teamed up with a mentor and we each worked on our own script and developed it with our mentor. So that was quite a few years ago.
Now, you recently wrote that we have kind of left the period where there was a profound belief in the power of the polymath. So tell our listeners, what is a polymath and why don't we believe him anymore?
Well, what I was writing about was the mid-century polymaths, so sort of people like Giaponti and Alvar Aalto, who did lots of things at the same time. So they were sort of architects, they were editors, they were furniture designers. So Arne Jacobsen, for instance, designed the SAS Hotel in Copenhagen, and he designed not only the building, but he designed the furniture, including the egg chair and so on, some famous pieces, cutlery, the interiors, the door handles, just about everything. So he was one of these sort of famous polymaths.
And that is the definition of a polymath, basically, is somebody who juggles a lot of plates at the same time.
And is good at it.
Yeah, it doesn't drop them.
Absolutely. And the polymaths sort of often ended up with these sort of amazing projects that were sort of totally cohesive, like the SAS Hotel. So where there were all the borders and boundaries between those different disciplines kind of dissolved and you ended up with something really special. In the article, I was kind of saying, I think now we're in an era of specialization, or certainly in the UK, where everyone's so focused on their little niche that it's quite hard to be a polymath. So I think there are some, and maybe they're coming back. But I was talking about this sort of special age in the 50s and 60s, especially in places like Italy and Scandinavia, where polymaths really seemed to thrive and do all sorts of amazing things.
There was all that style in Scandinavia and Italy, right?
Yeah, and I think in Italy, for example, just after the war, there wasn't a huge amount of work for architects just in architecture. So a lot of architects became other things as well. So they would design furniture or they design products or, radios or, chairs, whatever it might be, or they might teach and go and edit a magazine. So I think there was just this sort of cross-fertilization between disciplines because of this, and lots of collaboration, lots of people doing sort of unusual and interesting things, and I think that's quite important. I mean, I think you start to see it in some art schools again in the UK, for instance. I don't know about the United States, but I think there's quite something quite special about it.
That was the whole point of the Bauhaus in the 30s and 40s, right? Was this idea of the architect as artist in the full sense of the word. So art, furniture, architecture, music, dance, photography, everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think in the post-war period, the mid-century era, there were, well, some of the Bauhaus masters were still around, but, there were others who were kind of following that Bauhaus model, like sort of Mies van der Rohe in Chicago or, the Ulm School in Germany, where they were trying to recreate that spirit of collaboration, as you say, between the sort of the artists, the photographers, the filmmakers, the product designers. And so, yeah, it was that kind of model, exactly.
I think in America, the Eames were probably the best known polymaths here because of their broad reach into so many sectors. I remember when their famous film, The Power of 10, came out. And I'm guessing it was shown in every school in America on one of those loud 16 millimeter reel-to-reel projectors at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as you say, they were doing all sorts of things, weren't they? I mean, I think the IBM pavilion at the World's Fair they designed, so many different things. Obviously, the furniture, plywood, products, as you say, films.
Many films.
So many things, graphic design.
Your book is great. I really loved the previous atlas where you were talking about mid-century modern houses, because of course that's our thing. And this is the book of masterpieces that are all commercial or sort of institutional in some way or another. You break your book up into sections by country, and of course there are a lot of these in the United States. Did you get to visit all of these, or how did you collect this information? Because it's a massive amount of information and photographs here.
Yeah, it's a big project. It was a big project. And I think after the first atlas that you kindly mentioned, the Atlas of Mid-Century Modern Houses, I think we just felt there was quite a lot of unfinished business. And so I was talking to my publisher at Phaidon, and we thought, okay, let's do a companion volume. So let's do everything that isn't a house. So as you say, museums, sports stadiums, cultural centres, everything that you can imagine that isn't a house. And then the two books can be, read independently, or they can be sort of taken together as companion volumes, but there isn't really an overlap between the content in the two books. But the format, as you say, is very similar. So it's a country by country. It sort of began with a huge research project, sort of, casting the net really wide. So as with the first book, we ended up with a long list of about sort of 800 to 1,000 projects, sort of all around the world. And then the hard bit is starting to sort of whittle that down.
Oh, yes.
So then you sort of start whittling away and end up with about sort of 450 projects.
Did you find something on every continent?
I think we tried to, yeah. I mean, I think there was we're looking closely at Africa, for instance. We wanted to make sure that every continent was properly represented. We were looking at Asia. Is the Antarctic a continent? I'm
yes,
sure we got
it is. McMurdo Station, sure.
According to Jeopardy, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we might have missed one or two, but we were trying to really spread the net as far as we could and represent places that perhaps haven't been quite so well represented in the past. So, perhaps Central America, Latin America, as I say, some of the projects in Africa. So that geographical spread was really important. And it was sort of part of the story of the book that we were trying to tell, this sort of bigger story about the sort of way mid-century modernism spread its way around the world and how international style then sort of became something more expressive and experimental as it was taken up in different countries like Brazil, where you've got Oscar Niemeyer famously developing this more expressive style, or
Yes.
Felix Candela in Mexico with his sort of shell structures, and so on and so on. So part of the story was how mid-century international style went out into the world, but morphed into something much more sort of creative and expressive and contextual to sort of some degree. So like tropical modernism, for example, or the way it was sort of adapted in different parts of the world.
Well, speaking of tropical modernism, with the recent hurricanes, we lost some of the Sanderling Beach Club in Sarasota, Florida. And I was wondering, in putting together the book, how you decided about buildings that were gone. Because there were some of those, right, in the book that had been destroyed?
Yeah, there's a few that are lost, or a few that have adapted or changed changed their purpose, perhaps been converted into a hotel like the TWA terminal, or Mies van der Rohe's IBM building in Chicago, which I think is partly a hotel now. So there are some examples like that where they've changed their purpose. And as you say, a few that have been lost sort of over the years. And the same was true in the Atlas of Mid-Century Modern Houses that we did. I think we might have talked about this last time around, actually, that there were a few that had unfortunately been lost over the years. I mean, I think in the UK, I feel quite optimistic that we're starting to sort of reevaluate mid-century modern, and we're looking more closely at those buildings and perhaps adapting them for other uses or turning them into residential if it was an office building, perhaps. Or, I mean, what would you say the situation is in the US at the moment?
Well, it's pretty dicey over here. I mean, a lot of things are under threat. There's a huge amount of construction happening, and a lot of that wants to shove the old stuff out of the way, even some things that are fairly young. We just learned recently that a building at Salford University in England, which is only 30 years old, it won the 1996 Best New Building Award from the RIBA. They're looking to tear that down now. I mean, this is getting crazy.
Why?
Well, there's something cool over here called the 30-year rule. So a building has to be at least 30 years old to be eligible for listing by Historic England. So if a building is from the 90s, for example, which I think that particular building was, it may not have got to that point yet. So now there's this a new campaign here to look at all the buildings from the 1990s that deserve to be listed and protected, and basically as a way of trying to catch up. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a number of campaigns about 90s buildings that deserve to be listed and protected, just as there was a campaign about 60s, 70s buildings being preserved and protected over here some time ago.
Was that spurred by this controversy about this particular building, or is this just a movement that's been coming along?
I think it was coming along because Historic England were already, I understand, preparing a review of these buildings, knowing that it's sort of coming up towards 30 years. So when they realize that a series of buildings or a particular style of building is coming up for that review, sometimes they'll instigate a research project that starts looking at those, that particular era, which is what happened basically quite a number of years ago with the mid-century buildings. They began this sort of process of review.
And what's happened with this particular building is that the university is trying to get ahead of that 30-year rule and get this building torn down because they want to do something else with the property.
I think that's probably right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the interesting side effect of this advanced study of these buildings in the 90s is that some of the property owners now want to tear them down rather than have them be listed in the historical register.
Yeah, basically. And also the other thing you can do is if you own one of these buildings and you want to stop it being listed and protected, is you can apply for basically an exemption from listing, which is an official document. So some developers may apply for this thinking they're going to get this piece of paper, which basically stops the building being listed for a number of years. And during that time, they've got a chance to redevelop it, tear it down. So there's this peculiar piece of paper that you can get that basically means your building is exempt for listing for, I think it's 5 years, something like that.
Sort of the opposite of a stay of execution.
Yes.
It is. It is.
It's a most wanted poster
Right.
for demolition.
Yeah, it's quite a curious thing. So it's the opposite of a listing. So, some developers use that as a tool, and it means, potentially that site could be more valuable to them if they get an exemption from listing, because they can redevelop it, they can tear it down and do something else with it. So that happens more with commercial buildings, though, with, sort of office buildings or prime sites, in the centre of London or the centre of a city where they think they might be able to get a skyscraper or, go taller or something like that. But I think sort of being more optimistic, I mean, like there's a couple of projects in the book, but one of my favourite buildings in the book is Richard Seifert's Space House, which is a cylindrical drum in Holborn in London. And I just think it's an amazing building. And that was listed a few years ago and has just been upgraded by some very enlightened developers who have basically renovated it. They've stripped it out, they've updated it and restored it beautifully. And they're just about to sort of relaunch it and let it out again to tenants. So I think there are some encouraging stories over here as well.
Hang on just a second. I want to look that up because I spent time in Holborn and I don't know this building.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful surprise because it's just off Kingsway. So you kind of come out of this tube station, walk across Kingsway, and you go down a side street and you come across this sort of wonderful space house, which is in the Atlas, actually.
How tall is it?
It's
13, 14 stories, it looks like.
Yeah, something like that.
And designed originally as an office space?
Yeah, and they've managed to add an extra story on the top.
Oh, really?
Because basically they just had sort of plant and machinery up on the top where the best of the views were in the old days. So,
right.
so
how about a rotating restaurant?
That's so mid-century, Tom.
I know.
Well, that's the next thing. That's because the post office tower, which is another wonderful mid-century building, did have a rotating restaurant. And that's just been bought for redevelopment as well. So that may well come back as part of the redevelopment, and we'll have our rotating restaurant again. Yeah. I think you have there's a few, aren't there? Isn't there like Seattle Space Needle? Does that have
I was in one in Reykjavik in Iceland. There's a science museum there, and they have a restaurant on top. I think it's the only time I've ever been in one. And yes, it slowly moves around, and it's high, so you have a pretty decent view of the city.
It's a good thing to do once. It's one of those bucket list items.
Absolutely, yeah.
You just have to be careful when you step from the center part where you get the food out to where your table is by the window. I mean, it's moving really slowly, but don't plant your feet in the wrong spot.
Yeah, don't stop for a conversation at the edge of it.
Right.
I did that one time.
Yeah. And can you feel it moving?
Yes.
While you're eating?
The one in Reykjavik, not really. I mean, you really have to look out the window and realize that the view's different than it was 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
It takes generally about an hour to make a rotation.
Yeah.
Roughly. So depending on the size and the diameter of it, it does move rather slowly.
Yeah, well, I really hope they bring ours back in London at the Post Office Tower, because they shut it many years ago. They were worried about security, so they shut this restaurant. You haven't been able to, unless you have a special permission, you haven't been able to go up the tower for years.
Was the food any good?
Well, we'll have to see
Okay.
when they reopen
Right.
reopen the restaurant.
The book is The Atlas of Mid-Century Modern Masterpieces, something you should have on your gift list. Thank you so much, Dominic.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
That was George with Dominic Bradbury. Returning podcast guest Pierluigi Serraino is an architect and well-known author based in San Francisco. But he's, of course, Italian. Pierluigi grew up in Messina
Go Sicily.
and studied architecture at the University of Roma,
Go Sapienza.
as well as UCLA
Go Bruins.
and SCI-Arc.
It's the Hogwarts of design.
Thank you, George. Before founding an independent practice, he worked for the big guys, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, then Anshin Allen, and Mark Mack. He's lectured extensively on California modernism and is the author of several great books, including our favorites, Modernism Rediscovered and NorCal Mod, Icons of Northern California Modernism. His latest is The Modern Garden, the Outdoor Architecture of Mid-Century America. Welcome back, Pierluigi.
A pleasure being here.
You know, Modernism Rediscovered really is one of my all-time favorite books because you really did not only rediscover houses that no one really knew about, but it kind of opened up the whole movement of mid-century modern on a bigger scale. I mean, people saw that and just went crazy. And that was what, like 15 years ago, 20 years ago now?
Now, that was, next year is going to be 25 years.
Wow. Time flies when you're having
It
fun.
came out in fall 2000. Modernism Rediscovered grew out of my thesis at UCLA. I was going for an MA in history and theory of architecture. And I made a remark on a picture of the Kaufman House, a classic picture. And I said, I don't know if we're liking the picture or if we're liking the buildings or if we're liking both. And the teacher at the time told me about these abandoned files, or these files that Schulman was talking as abandoned. And she asked me if I was interested in looking at them. So I wrote a letter to Schulman.
This is Julius Schulman, the photographer.
Julius Schulman called me, which was, extraordinary because he was already a figure of authority. And I come from old Europe, who was very hierarchical. So to having a master calling me a complete unknown was really a miracle. But he was very gracious, and we met. And from there started this really, at this point, a lifelong journey, because with Schulman, I discovered many things. Schulman was simply entry point into a vast world of the relationships dynamic, the politics of representation, how people become famous. And in a way, even the existence of U.S. Modernist Radio, your passion, is a direct result of that, because it just simply unleashed a watershed of realizations, to which each project confirms that. But that was really the inception. And the times were right, and Schulman was available. Taschen was the perfect publisher to send this message. This was before the era of the social media, and we're simply reinforcing that message. This latest project dovetails with that particular project.
Well, this book is about the modern garden, the outdoor architecture associated with mid-century modernism. And back in that era, just about every house had some landscape architect associated with it, a trend that we don't see today. Certainly in most developments, you don't see landscape design around the individual houses. You might see it around the community. But landscape design was a very essential piece of shaping what was all around these beautiful houses. So how did that trend evolve and also fall away over time, Pierluigi?
This project emerged from a few realizations that I had. It was initially an intuition, and then it became a conclusion. And it came from two different experiences. One is about 7 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, I started posting on Instagram. And on Instagram, I have a pattern where I post usually twice per day. One is a vintage image of one of these great photographers that's available through public domain or through archives that I have. I'm authorized to sort of have them circulate these images, and others of images of buildings of the mid-century period most of the times, where I go there and photograph. It's just a sort of a journal. And while the target of my visit was actually the building, by the time I arrived at the building, I was completely pumped by the beauty of the site. And I said, how come I do not understand that these buildings are really sitting on these extraordinary sites that have their spatial characters? I mean, they come with their proportions, with their majesty, so I'm not looking at the site as an arborist or as a gardener or as a geologist or as a civil engineer. I'm looking at them as an architect. And this kept happening again and again and again. Then it's been now almost 4 years that I've been working on a major monograph on Alvar Aalto. And I went to Finland several times. And I had the same experience. When I go and visit the buildings of Alvar Aalto, by the time I arrive at the building, it makes complete sense that the building is what it is because the architecture of the site already is suggestive of particular moves. And so I asked myself, how is it possible that I'm unaware of it? And I realized that the lack of understanding is the result of the overexposure of the general public to the use of a photography that is largely based on aggrandizing the building, looking at the building from the outside, looking at the building as facades. Before the arrival of architectural photography, any architect who wanted to develop an education about space would embark on what is called the Grand Tour, or even before the existence of the Grand Tour, it was in essence a travel experience where you go and visit the buildings. And this realization of the importance of siting the buildings was very clear. With the arrival of modernity, there was the invention of photography and also architectural photography. And the practice of architects of collecting pictures of buildings became prevailing. So architects start traveling less and less and being influenced more and more by photography. When you look at a photograph, to a large extent, we look at pictures of facades, of building exteriors or interiors, but the experience of the site is largely compromised. The understanding of how these buildings fit into the land, which is a strength, among other things, of California modernism. The experience of the mid-century period, which is still cognizant of the importance of the site as an architectural asset, as opposed to simply a background on which to put a building of whatever heroic ambitions. And in essence, with this book, I mined the archives of architectural photographers where the assignments that we're looking at were pointing away from the building and looking at the land and see how much we have lost in between, which is something that we experience in any site visit. I don't know if any of you has been to the house and studio of Alden Dow in Midland. It's an extraordinary synthesis of architecture.
Beautiful. Yes.
It's one thing. It's just one thing. And Wright was making that claim. Neutra was making that claim because he had a background in landscape architecture. And Aalto was making that claim. So I then developed a book project. And I also developed a set of questions, and I interviewed a couple of greats, among them Peter Walker. Well, Peter Walker, the great landscape architect who is well into his 90s and graduated from the Harvard Graduate School of Design under the era of Jose Luiset. And I asked, how is it possible that we don't really have an understanding of the importance of the site? And he told me, among other things, that one of the problems with the modernists is that for them, the site is just a flat piece of land on which they put their building, and that's it. Whereas there's a lot going on the site. And in fact, there is a lot going on the site. And he sort of launched me into a whole appreciation of the environmental totalities of which the building is part of. So we already have a language of indoor-outdoor architecture, which is pretty much used ubiquitously. This notion assumes that there's a hierarchy where the building dominates the site. I just go from the inside to the outside. But in fact, the outside can come into the inside. It's a mutually reinforcing notion where the garden is already part of the house. The garden comes into the house, and the enmeshment of these two realms produces the enormous legacy of the mid-century period, largely. So that's a story that I wanted to tell. Beware of being overly focused on the building at the expense of seeing the site as a whole. The site not just as a natural marvel, but something that has its inherent architectural beauty. I mean, if you go in any park in Utah, you cannot not be overwhelmed by the architectural beauty of the site. I mean, they're incredible, the proportions, the texture of the land. You can do an architectural reading of the site as opposed to what the modernists did early on, where for them the site was a place to put the road infrastructure and the sewer lines and the electrical lines. There was never a conversation on the organic because so much of the focus was on mass production, industrialization, and the like. And there was one sentence that really struck me that was written by James Rose. He was studying at Harvard in the landscape architecture department, and then Gropius arrives, and they start him and then Kylie and Garrett Ekbo, who were classmates. Garrett Ekbo started taking courses in the architecture department. And remember that the Bauhaus never had a landscape architect on its faculty. So they got exposed to a way of dealing with space that was radically different from what the landscape department was doing, which was still connected to the Beaux-Arts period. We're talking about 1937. So by then, there were already pretty much 25 years of modern architecture ahead, and landscape was just way behind. And James Rose says, how unfair it is that I come out of a car, go through a Rousseauian garden, and enter into a machine à habiter. Something is not quite right. And that is exactly the issue. You can come up with an idea of modern space. Well, you need to come up with an idea of modern furniture, a modern product design, modern lighting, which is what pretty much Aalto did, where when you enter into the one of his early buildings, he really designed everything in a moment where doing custom work wasn't going to break the budget. But the notion of the landscape had not been developed as of yet. There's only one aspect that is really critical about this in relation to Aalto, and it's that the invention of landscape architecture as a separate discipline from architecture came out in the 1980s. So when Aalto was doing his work, he was also acting as a landscape architect. And that is the reason why the buildings have so much unity with the land. It was a revelation to me, because then I realized why certain buildings feel displaced in relation to their sites and why certain buildings are so excellent in relation to their site. Bill Kreisel of Pamela Kreisel was also a licensed landscape architect. And that's why his buildings are so extraordinarily coherent with the desert architecture of the land, because they're connected as a singular statement. And Thornton Ladd, another great architect of the mid-century period, who had a practice of Ladd and Kelsey, studied landscape architecture. And that's why his buildings are so beautifully sited. So this book tells the story of this realization in 4 long essays and an apparatus of images largely not seen that expand vastly the notion of what the outdoor is. Because the garden brings up images of something, of an amenity that can be fundamentally deleted if budgets are not so friendly or don't allow it. But in fact, they enrich the experience of the architecture and the space itself.
Well, I know for just the average person who's not an architect, you're really not conscious of the landscape architecture coming to a building. If you're in a city and you're going to visit something, you hop out of your car or the subway or you've walked there and you may sort of get the vibe of it, but you're going for the building, right? And then if you do it again a second time or a third time, you you start to notice a little bit more, and you get a sense of seeing the strategy behind how the whole property is put together to complement the building.
Or you may be conscious, but not conscious that you're conscious. It has a subtle effect on you that at first realize.
So my question is, Pierluigi, how can the average person just see more when they approach a building? What advice do you give them?
Well, I would encourage them to let their body respond to the site. The tendency is to appreciate the project for its visual qualities. Because by the time we arrive at a building, especially if we're seeing it through photographs, we are conditioned subconsciously to appreciate the nuances of the building, which are there and they're elegant. I am not discounting their presence. I'm only saying that it's an incomplete part of the story, and the story is environmental. The architecture of the site starts already the moment you enter the parcel of land, the sequence of arrival to the building itself. And if you look at what is in the book, in essence, you will notice that when the photographer needs to photograph the landscapes, he or she has to tilt down the camera to capture the garden. So if you stay always at an eye level and you look forward, inevitably you're going to be looking at the building and the exterior of the building. And that also creates a tremendous emphasis and investment of resources in facades. That's why a lot of architects obsess about random patterns and fenestrations and panelizations, things that have only a marginal role in the experience of the building, which for the most part is connected to the ground condition. The Nordic architects, I'm not just saying Aalto, Jacobsen, Sverre Fehn, Arne Korsmo, Jørn Utzon, Asplund, they were all connected to the land as part of their heritage because they were never occupied by the Roman Empire. They never saw a temple. They never saw a road. They only knew nature as their assets. And that was the great awakening of the 20th century of that tradition. In California, Garrett Ekbo was born in Alameda, California, and he ended up at Harvard. And William Worcester and Thomas Church in 1937 knocked on the door of Alvar Aalto at his newly built house. And Aalto had on the boards Villa Mairea with the famous pool, which in California we know as the kidney pool. And in fact, it was the metaphor there of a finished lake. Before that, the great landscape architect Thomas Church, who designed over 2,000 gardens, and he was based here in the Bay Area, had done Italian gardens and Spanish gardens. And at that moment, he changes completely his career. And that is where Larry Alprin also came through Harvard and settled in the Bay Area. Essentially, they changed the scope of landscape architecture to include everything. Larry Alprin thought of a piece of freeway as an infrastructural piece. I mean, think about how incredible that is as a notion, where Alprin would be hired by structural engineer to site overpasses. So the idea is that, in fact, for the general public, really experiencing with their body the site is a fundamental reward in the experience of space. Before photography, we had a cultural space through our body. With photography, we enter a visual cultural space, and we're very refined. I mean, our eyes now demand a level of excellence, which is extraordinary, but at the expense of feeling the texture of the materials, feeling the weight of our body on the soil, experiencing the soundscape of the site, which is impossible to capture in photography. And that's why going in remote places is really critical.
Pierluigi, you've named all the great MVPs of landscape design that are featured in your book, which is called The Modern Garden, The Outdoor Architecture of Mid-Century America. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, close us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Accountable is her middle name, or it could be Agnes. We really don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back with another dog-eared, page-turning edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.